Our idea of totalitarianism is based on the Cold War. We think of the Soviet gulags, we think of the secret police, we think of bread lines. The problem is we don't really understand what totalitarianism is.
A soft totalitarianism is gripping the Western world, and it's our fear of suffering that's allowing it to take hold, says Rod Dreher. He's the author of Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents.
That one lone Chinese protester in Tiananmen Square who stood in front of the tank. You want to be that guy, but that guy didn't become that guy in that moment. Everything that led him to that point had built in him the kind of conscience that gave him that courage.
In the face of growing tyranny, how do we stand our ground and hold on to our values, our conscience, or our faith? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kelly. Rod Dreher, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I've been reading Live Not by Lies. I've been meaning to read it for a while. I've had an incredibly powerful, frankly, experience of reading it. I'll just say it straight up. But you contend something in this book that's very foundational to the whole, I guess, concept of what you're talking about, that a kind of soft totalitarianism, as you call it, is here and ever expanding. And there's some people who would agree, but I think there's a lot of people who would wonder what you're talking about.
Well, it sounds crazy to North Americans to think that our society, our liberal democracies, could be turning totalitarian. I thought it was crazy too when I first had this proposed to me by a physician here in the United States who called me one day back in 2015, I think it was, and we had a mutual friend, and he was very anxious. He said, look, my elderly mother lives with me and my wife here in America. She was born and raised in Czechoslovakia and spent 4 years in a communist prison being tortured for her Catholic faith before she came to America. And she said to me, son, the things I see happening in America today remind me of what things were like in my homeland when the communists first came to power. And this is what the doctor told me, and I thought, well, you know, my mom is old too. She watches a lot of cable news. Maybe this old lady's just being an alarmist. But I made a habit of whenever I would travel to conferences and things like that, if I would meet someone who had emigrated to America from a communist country, I would simply ask them, are the things you're seeing happen in America today in terms of cancel culture, wokeness, things like that, does it remind you of what you left behind? Every single one of them said yes. And if you talk to them long enough, they would get really angry that Americans don't take them seriously. Now, I think one reason we don't take them seriously is because our idea of totalitarianism is based on the Cold War. You know, we think of the Soviet gulags, we think of the secret police, we think of bread lines and censorship and so on and so forth. Well, we don't have that now. So how can this be totalitarianism? Well, I think the problem is we don't really understand what totalitarianism is. It's a word and a concept that emerged in the 20th century by, of all people, through Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy. It's a word he came up with to describe a system in which everybody believes the same thing. The state has power over every aspect of life. And this is what we saw emerge in Nazi Germany and also in, of course, Soviet Russia and the countries that Soviet Russia took over. What does this have to do with us? Here in our liberal democratic societies, we are seeing the expansion of a philosophy that, for lack of a better term, we can call wokeness. It has to do with identity politics, it has to do with like critical race theory, gender theory, all of these things in this broad idea of wokeness. It has conquered all of the institutions of American life. It has conquered first universities, then the media, then it went on to sports, law, medicine, even of late the military and the CIA. So the government doesn't have to get involved necessarily to enforce the wokeness when you have all the other institutions doing it. Most important of all is capitalism, woke capitalism. When big business absorbed critical race theory and gender theory and all of these things and started enforcing it within their companies, as is their right to do in our liberal democracy, it was game over. because in a liberal democracy, a capitalist democracy like ours, when big business wants something, it sets the tone for the rest of society. So what the people who grew up under communism are seeing is that when you live in a society where people are afraid to say what they think for fear of losing their jobs or being sent to the social margins, when people come to realize there is only one opinion tolerated, whether it's enforcement's coming from the government or from the institutions in society, it's still totalitarian. And finally, I should say that our idea of totalitarianism is only focuses on politics, but in a totalitarian society, we certainly have one political party or leader that rules, but everything in society becomes political. So today you have things like last summer we had during Pride Month, Kellogg's cereal put a pronoun guide on the side of breakfast cereal boxes for children, and they encourage children to come up with their own pronouns. They have turned breakfast cereal into an occasion for propagandizing for this woke propaganda. This is the sort of thing that people who grew up under communism, they see it everywhere, that this is infesting all aspects of life. But we Americans and other North Americans and even people in Western Europe, our idea of totalitarianism is gulags and breadlines, so we think we're free. What these people who came up under communism are telling us, we are increasingly unfree. And if we don't wake up now to what's happening, we're going to lose our freedom, and this soft totalitarianism is going to turn hard.
You have some pretty incredible stories that you've discovered, or at least made me aware of, through reading Live Not by Lies. And you kind of open with a man named Father Kolokovich, who basically went out and sounded the alarm to Christians ahead of time, seeing something that nobody else was seeing. And I think you're trying to be sort of today's Kolokovich, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. Father Tomislav Kolokovich was someone I had never heard of, but he turns out he's one of the unsung heroes of the Cold War. In 1943, he was a Jesuit priest in Zagreb, Croatia, his homeland, and he was doing anti-Nazi work. He got a tip that the Gestapo was coming to arrest him, so he escaped and went to Slovakia, his mother's homeland, and began teaching in the Catholic University in Bratislava, the capital. Now, because Father Kolokovich had done, in his seminary studies, had studied the Soviet Union, because he wanted to be a missionary there, he understood the communist way of thinking. And he told his students, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is, when it's over, the Soviets are going to be ruling this country, and the first thing they're going to do is come after the church. We have to be ready. So what he did was bring together these groups for prayer and study and discussion. Most of them young Catholics. There were a few priests who were involved. They would come together and talk about what they were seeing happen in their society around them, talk about what the teachings of the Catholic Church had to say about what they were supposed to do in the face of this, and then they would make an action plan to go out and do these things. Within 2 years of Father Kolokovich arriving in Slovakia, each town of any size had one of these Kolokovich groups, prayer groups, reading groups, study groups, and they laid the groundwork for the underground church. Now, this is so interesting. The Catholic bishops of Slovakia chastised him. They said, Father, you're frightening people. It won't happen here. It can't happen here. Stop scaring people. But Father Kolokovich did not listen because he had studied communism. Sure enough, when the Iron Curtain fell over Slovakia, the first thing the communists did was come after the churches and the church leaders. The only reason that there was an underground church in Slovakia for the 40 years of communism is because Father Kolokovich and his early followers laid the groundwork and prepared people for what was to come. I believe here in the West today, we are living in a Kolokovich moment when Christians, non-Christians, anyone who is likely to fall into the category of dissident from the woke regime, the soft totalitarian regime, is going to be persecuted. It's already starting to happen in some places. It's soft now. I think it won't stay soft forever. We have got to use the liberty we have now, the time we have now, to build up the structures and the networks that will allow us to hold on to our faith and to our religious practices and be resilient in the face of suffering.
What makes you so sure? Or is it just simply the alarm bells being rung by these people that have come from, communist countries saying, yes, I really recognize this? What makes you so sure that this is really the way it's going to go? Because it feels like that when you read the book, right? That you're sure.
Well, where is the pushback to all this wokeness coming from? Thank God we're starting to see it in some places, like in Northern Virginia. We saw in the fall of 2021 parents finally waking up to what was being done to their children in the schools and pushing back. I hope this happens everywhere. But overall, the fact that the elites in our society are all in on wokeness, that tells me that this is something that is going to endure. One thing that a lot of us don't recognize in America, because we're small d Democrats and we think that the power comes from the people. And theoretically that's true. But in fact, most social change comes from the elites. When the elites have when the elites have been captured by a particular ideology, that's when real and lasting social change comes. And I don't see any pushback right now, as you and I are talking, to wokeness. A lot of people hate it, but I don't see any organized pushback to it. Plus, the fact that the tech industry is completely woke and have the capacity to surveil every single American to intimate levels. And Americans are fine with that because it's been sold to us as consumer convenience. Every time we put an app on our smartphone, it sends up data about our daily lives to companies. Well, we think as long as it's not the government, what's the big deal? Well, guess what? The enforcers of woke ideology are not just the government, it's also big tech and major corporations. We have seen in the People's Republic of China what is possible to do when you have a total surveillance environment and when you have a totalitarian government that is able and willing to use all the data it collects that people generate from their online activities and use that to try to control people. It can be done. And I think the same thing is coming to America. I don't think it'll be as severe as in China. I hope not. But it will happen, and it will happen too because most people don't want trouble. I think this is one of the interesting things about soft totalitarianism is the old totalitarianism depended on inflicting pain and terror and fear on people to make them conform. That's not what we're dealing with now. What we're dealing with now is something more like Aldous Huxley, not George Orwell's 1984, but Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which the totalitarian state there got people to conform by making them comfortable. There's this great scene in Brave New World where the dissident, his name is John the Savage, he comes in to meet the world controller for Europe, who doesn't want to torture him into accepting their authority. He just wants to say, why won't you do this? We give you everything you need. We give you drugs to make you happy. We give you pornography. There's all the sex you want, et cetera, et cetera. Materialistically, you're fine. So why do you want to live outside of this? John the Savage says, because I want freedom. I want God. I want poetry. I want sin. I want suffering because that's what human life is. That's what it means to be human. The world controller says, well, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. John says, that's it. I am fighting for my right to be unhappy. Well, flash forward to where we are today. If you are a dissident against this, against wokeness, against this tyranny of comfort, then you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. How popular is that going to be? In Live Not by Lies, I tell the story about being on a tram in Budapest, the capital of Hungary, traveling through with my interpreter, a young Catholic Hungarian woman. We were going to an interview. And she said to me, she said, Rod, I struggled so much with my own friends, my own Catholic friends here. She's in her early 30s. When I tell them that my husband and I have been fighting or I'm struggling with our little boy, it's hard to raise a kid, they cut me off and say, Anna, just divorce your husband, put your kid in daycare, go back to the workplace, you've got to be happy. She said, I try to tell them, I am happy. I'm happy being a wife. I'm happy being a mom, but it's not always easy. They have no capacity, she said, to understand that suffering and struggle is part of human life and in fact part of the good life. They're terrified of anything that makes them anxious, any struggle they have. I looked at her and said, Anna, sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She looked at me and said, that's it. Where did you get that? I pulled out my smartphone, went to chapter 17 of Brave New World. In any case, this is the source of the tyranny. We are so afraid to be poor. We're so afraid to be anxious, to be unhappy, that so many of us will do just about anything to avoid trouble and to protect our middle-class comfort.
Well, okay, so many places I want to go here because there's this kind of terrible irony in exactly what you're talking about. I accept your premise here. And, but at the same time, what we're seeing in society is an increase kind of in unhappiness, right? Curiously, with this, inordinate focus on happiness and comfort and so forth. I want to touch on that. Sure. Before we go there, though, I want to touch on this really interesting element. When we think of these revolutions, let's take the Bolsheviks, right, or what happened in China. You don't imagine the elites being behind it. You imagine that it's a small group of revolutionaries that somehow, take over the system and, redistribute the wealth. And of course, we know how we know how it happens. I mean, you and I know how it happens. But somehow you make the case in the book that the elites were very much behind it, in Russia, for example. And I find that very interesting and, in a sense, counterintuitive. So maybe we can expand on that a little bit.
Sure. For most of the 19th century, after Marx published the Communist Manifesto in the mid-century, the Marxist and the socialist in Russia struggled to get any sort of footing. Nobody wanted to hear what they had to say. They remained fairly small, the radicals. And then in the early 1890s, a terrible famine swept part of Russia, and the imperial government failed to deal with it well. I think they lost 500,000 people, died of starvation. That was the first big blow that the Tsarist regime had that showed that it was incompetent. And it was for the first time, people who were stakeholders in society, middle-class people, the merchant class, things like that, they began to wonder, is this system all it's cracked up to be? And they began to listen to their educated children, who were, in many cases, Marxists. And then after the turn of the 20th century, there was the Russo-Japanese War, where the Tsarist military was badly defeated by the Japanese, and that also struck a huge blow against the legitimacy of the regime. At the same time, in elite intellectual circles, radicalism it was all the rage. In fact, one of the things that shocked me, I found out that in early 20th century Russia, Satanism was a big thing. It's not that they actually were Satanists, but among the literary and artistic set, they looked to Lucifer as the poster boy for the sovereign will. He didn't care about anything but his own pleasure and will, and they aspired to that. All of these things were bubbling in Russian society, and when the elites lost confidence in the system, it was over for the Tsar, even before the shooting took place. And of course, as we know, Russia got involved in World War I in 1914, lost badly, and there was nobody left to support the Tsar. So the Bolshevik Party itself was rather small, but it was ruthless, and it took advantage of the widespread discontent and loss of faith in the system to rush in and seize power. And we all know what happened there. So I think that what I would want your viewers to take away from this is, don't think that these revolutions come from the masses rising up from below. The revolutionary class are actually the intellectuals and the social and economic elites.
In the book, you reference, Hannah Arendt's kind of landmark work on the roots of totalitarianism. It's amazing how little knowledge of this body of information there is in, I guess, among today's intellectual class and frankly in education in general. You would think it would be, kind of required reading.
Hannah Arendt was a German Jewish refugee from Nazism, and after the end of the Second World War, she set out to try to understand how it was that in Germany and Russia, totalitarianism of the right, as in Germany, or of the left, as in Russia, how it came to power. What aspects of life, their social life in those countries, made them susceptible to totalitarianism. And to read this book from the point of view of the 21st century is pretty shocking when you think about what's happening in our society. Arendt said that by far the most important aspect that laid those countries open to totalitarianism was atomization of the people, mass atomization, and widespread loneliness. Mm-hmm. She said that in both countries, which had come out of the First World War and also of industrialization, all of these things which blew society apart and severed people's ties to the institutions and the ways of life and even their families and communities that gave their life structure and meaning, that all left a great mass of people lonely and not knowing who they can trust and where they didn't have any direction in their life. Well, along comes Hitler in Germany and Lenin in the Soviet Union or in Russia and says, here, we can provide you with meaning in life, we can provide you with a sense of purpose and a sense of solidarity. And people who felt all alone and isolated rallied to that. Well, we have that today too, here in the West. One of the things that shocked me about reporting this book out was to learn that the loneliest, in terms of self-reporting, the loneliest generation in American life is not the elderly, which you would expect they would be. In fact, it's Generation Z, the youngest people, who are the most connected with this artificial social network, but there's no substitute for human companionship. So that was the most important revolutionary or totalitarian fact, mass loneliness. Other factors, the loss of authority. Institutions lost authority, religion lost authority, all of the things that had given people meaning in life and structure and a sense of direction, those all came into question because of the war and other things. And so people were desperate. They needed direction. Totalitarianism promised it to them. It was a false promise, but it was something that people grabbed onto. Another aspect, the willingness to believe propaganda, to believe any lie as long as it conformed to what people wanted to believe in the first place. Now, this is widespread in our society today, both on the left and the right. When we lose a desire to know the truth, even if the truth hurts, even if the truth goes against what we want to believe, then we are opening the door to totalitarianism, again, of either the left or the right. So these were some of the main factors that led those countries to become totalitarian. And I see, when I read Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, I mean, it was like a light flashing saying, look what's happening in our own country today. We somehow think that our money and our wealth, our democratic history is going to protect us from this. But as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Soviet dissident, said, people around the world think that what happened in Russia can't happen here. In fact, it can happen in any country on earth under the right set of circumstances.